Well, I guess we should get started so you can all make it up to bodegas as soon as it stops raining or uptown. This is supposed to be informal, so all of you who are in chairs, sit on the floor. Get down and sit. No, just kidding. Just kidding. Don't do that. What I thought I'd do is, since I'm a shameless self-promoter, I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book that's coming out on Tuesday, August 10th. And it's called How Capitalism Saved America. Subtitle is The Untold History of Our Country from the Pilgrims to the Present. And my publisher chose that. It makes it seem like I wrote a 10,000-page book, but it really is a short book. I just have the uncorrected page proofs here, right, and the print is very small, so the actual book will be bigger than this and all that. But it does have nice artwork. They have a picture of a pilgrim ship landing on in the Kennedy compound in Hyannis, Massachusetts here, otherwise known as Plymouth Rock. And so, but the genesis of it was probably a year and a half or so ago after the Enron scandal. I was lucky enough that a publisher I was working with in a division of Random House had a small cabal of conservative free market people who actually worked for for Random House, and so and they said that, well, in light of the Enron scandal and all this, there are going to be a lot of books coming out trashing capitalism and making the argument that this sort of behavior is inherent in capitalism. It's not just an aberration of a few of these crooks in some of these companies, that this is just business as usual. And sure enough, that's come true. And they liked my Lincoln book because it made them tons of money. And so they asked me if I would write another book, sort of a defense of capitalism, to counter all these other books that were sure to come out from a historical perspective. And so what I did was, if some of you might be familiar with Ayn Rand's old book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. It was published in 1962, and it's a collection of essays. Alan Greenspan is in there. Back before he became the Wizard of Oz, he was a pretty good guy. And Ron Paul, when he was here, I think it was last year, told us that there's this essay by Greenspan in this book, and it's a defense of the gold standard. And Ron Paul said at one of the congressional hearings where Greenspan was in front of Ron, he brought him this essay from 1962 and asked if he would autograph it, and asked him if he still believed in what he wrote in 1962. And he said, Greenspan said, "Sure, I believe every word of it still," and even though he's a central banker now. But anyway, this book is sort of modeled after that. I wanted to write a book that is readable, available to a wide audience. It could be used by college students or anybody, even Joe Sixpack might be able to comprehend, hopefully, the book. And so that's sort of the model of the book. I'm not going to talk for an hour or anything like that. We're supposed to only talk for 10 or 15 minutes and then open up to any questions, comments. But I started with a quote from Ron Paul, who really touches on the purpose for the book. He said this in an article on LouRockwell.com. He said, "Ignorance as well as disapproval for the natural restraints placed on market excesses that capitalism and sound markets impose cause our present leaders to reject capitalism and blame it for all the problems we face. If this fallacy is not corrected and capitalism is even further undermined, the prosperity that the free market generates will be destroyed." End quote. And I think that's a very true statement. Ron has a knack for really hitting the nail on the head there. And so, why so much anti-capitalism? My belief is, one, is just ignorance, as Ron says. And so the first chapter is the same title as Ayn Rand's first chapter, What is Capitalism? And so I'm not going to explain it to this group. What's that? So what is capitalism? Because I think a lot of the confusion is in the popular press and the popular media especially, is they equate capitalism with mercantilism. And they'll look at some cozy relationship between some corporation and government where they're granted a monopoly somewhere in the cable business, and they'll say, aha, that's the failure of capitalism, but it's not. And really, when the progressive era of the early 20th century, the progressives had a point, because after 1865, when the federal government really started spending big money on building the transcontinental railroads, and we had all this corporate welfare for the railroad corporations and others. There was tremendous corruption. The Grant administrations, after the American Civil War, were so corrupt that even his vice president was in trouble. The ambassador to England had to flee the country because he was involved in a stock swindle, and all this rotten corruption. There was a direct result from this cozy relationship between business and government that was initiated in those years. And so the progressives had a point. That's what they thought was capitalism, was this rotten corruption that we did get. And but they were confused. It wasn't capitalism. It wasn't free market capitalism. That was mercantilism. That's just the opposite of capitalism. And so that's part of the confusion. Another reason for all the anti-capitalism is utopianism. And I brought I'm going to read a few juicy quotes to you about some utopians. And I mentioned in my other lecture on Tuesday, I called this the nirvana fallacy, where the old practice of comparing the free market to some sort of utopian ideal, and the free market always comes up short, of course. And there's a real interesting book called Political Pilgrims. Has anyone ever read that book or know of it? Political Pilgrims? You heard of it by Paul Hollander. He's a sociologist at the University of Amherst. I don't know if he's still there or not, or if he's retired. But he took a look at the early years of the Soviet Union, Western intellectuals that traveled to the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Cuba, any communist country, and then would come back to the U.S. or to England, wherever, and write glowing reports about how they had found utopia in these countries. And so this search for utopia, I think, is another reason for so much condemnation of capitalism, because capitalism, of course, is not utopia. It's the real world. One example, Walter Duranty of the New York Times, a famous reporter of the New York Times, in the 1930s, he went to Russia, and he said that the Russian granaries were overflowing with grain, the cows were plump and contented, and of course this is a time when 6 million Ukrainians died, and many of them starved to death. And George Bernard Shaw went to Russia and said there was not and could not be a food shortage in the USSR. And of course they claimed that they had 70 years of drought, didn't they? Bad weather, called the food shortages. And in that year when George Bernard Shaw wrote that, Stalin's forced collectivization in the Ukraine caused the deaths of millions of people in the same time. W.E.B. Du Bois said that although Stalin was a perfect gentleman, he was a perfect gentleman who, quote, asked for neither adulation nor vengeance. He was reasonable and conciliatory. A nice guy. Stalin. Edmund Wilson, the famous literary critic Edmund Wilson, he said this: there has been in our times no parallel to the position of Gorky in the Soviet Union. That's probably true. In past a close friend of Lenin, he is at present a kind of commissar of literature and is perhaps closer to sharing the glory of Stalin than any one public man. Glory. Paul Baran, the Marxist economist, wrote about Cuba many years later, as a garden paradise where agricultural problems would melt away with a gigantic economic surplus. And Paul Sweezy, who Jeff Tucker sang about the other night, Paul Sweezy was in the songs that they were singing. He was similar. He talked about Cuba. He's saying he went there and he came back. He said, "With my faith in the human race restored because of the Cubans' purifying and liberating experiences." And he's talking about communism in Cuba. And Theodore Draper, he admitted that Cuban economic policy was, in his words, murderous, mendacious, brutal, and arbitrary, but it still should be admired because, quote, it is still socialist. So as long as Theodore Draper, famous writer, and the final one here. Let's see, two more. The executive director of PBS in the 70s, Frank Mankiewicz, interviewed Castro for his PBS audience, and then wrote a whole book about what a great guy Castro was. So it was totally praiseworthy. Norman Mailer swooned over Castro, saying this: "So Fidel Castro, I announced to the city of New York that you gave all of us some sense that there were heroes in the world." You were the first and greatest hero to appear in the world since the Second World War. This was when Castro was in New York City at the United Nations, and he was addressing himself. And the final one I'll give is George McGovern, senator, when he was a senator, who also met Castro. And he described him as a genius who responds knowledgeably on almost any subject, from agricultural methods to Marxist dialectics. End quote. What could be better than somebody could do that? And so this book, Political Pilgrims, is this filled with stories like that. And there are other books more up to date. This was published probably 25 years ago on the utopians and why there's always been this utopian penchant to look at these phony ideals, communism in theory being wonderful, or socialism, and comparing it to real-world capitalism, and it comes up short. And the Mises book, The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality, has always been one of my favorites, probably because I'm lazy and I like short books. I don't like big, long books. And but I'd urge you to, it's pretty cheap. You can buy. I think Lou still has them for sale out here, but. It's not real heavy to put in your suitcase when you go home. But Mises has some real insightful thoughts on why this anti-capitalistic mentality exists. And my second chapter is called Anti-Capitalism. So I have the first one is What is Capitalism? And one is ignorance again on people who amass large sums of money. The critics of this just simply don't understand that the way to amass large sums of money is to please large numbers of people. And another great book that you should all read is Liberalism by von Mises, which is online. Of course, the other one's probably online too. So, but you should still spend your money on it while you're here. You might not have this chance again to spend your money. But in one of the really good points that Mises made in Liberalism and many other places was that a lot of the things that we ordinary people enjoy, like refrigerators, originally were only available to the aristocracy, the wealthy aristocracy, because there were not economies of scale yet in production of these things, and only the rich could afford them. But then, that's not how to get rich. If you're a business person, you don't get rich by selling 50 refrigerators to the King of England and his family. You get rich by selling 50,000 or 50 million refrigerators. That's how you get really, really rich. And so things that were always initially luxuries for the aristocracy, capitalism produces them for the masses, so that the masses eventually enjoy these things. That's why every person in this room lives a better life than the King of England did at the time of the American Revolution. He didn't even have an indoor toilet, indoor plumbing for his toilets, did he? And it's all due to capitalism. Most people don't understand that. Resentment over frustrated ambition is another reason Mises gives for the anti-capitalistic mentality. A couple of good quotes from the book that I'll mention briefly here. He said, the resentment over frustrated ambition can be pervasive. Capitalism grants to each the opportunity to attain the most desirable position, which of course can only be attained by a few. Such is the attitude of the tramp against the man with a regular job, the factory hand against the foreman, the executive against the vice president against the company's president, the man who was worth $300,000 against the millionaire, and on and on and on. So resentment over our betters, and just some proportion of the population, and also scapegoating for your own shortcomings. I quoted him in a book I co-authored in 1985 saying that one of the main reasons for the anti-capitalistic mentality is that we all have our shortcomings. I discovered my first just yesterday, as a matter of fact, and it's human nature to try to blame someone else, and capitalists, especially successful people, successful capitalists, are easy scapegoats for all this. And then also I talk about mercantilists. Some of the worst enemies of capitalism are business people who get in bed with government and destroy the free market by adopting mercantilism. And also Mises has some really interesting comments on popular culture and how why it is so anti-market, anti-capitalistic. And I'd like to see a lot more work done on that. It's kind of an intriguing topic, but there's been very little done on why it is that the popular culture is so anti-market and the effects of that. And he talks about the truth that if you're, say, a movie star, the public is fickle. They might love your latest movie, then you make the next one with J-Lo, and they hate it. And so you're a big star, Academy Award, all the money, and then you're you go to buy groceries, and all the tabloids are trashing you as you go. And so who do you blame? Well, not you. You're a star, and so you blame the system. You blame the market, capitalism. That's what Mises has to say about that. And then the final group that I talk about, as far as the enemies of capitalism, is environmentalists, who I believe are generally the enemies of civilization. Not conservationists. These are people who want to protect duck habitat and things like that, Trout Unlimited. But the environmentalists are basically enemies of civilization. That's why they always want to shut down production of any kind of goods and services, oil. That's why they're anti-oil industry, anti-nuclear, anti-natural gas, and just anti any kind of energy, because they understand energy is the lifeblood of it used to be anyway, much more the lifeblood of capitalism. That's why they've always been endeavoring to shut down the energy industry. And so I deal with that also in the book. And the second part of the book is a series of fairly short chapters illustrating the myths of capitalism. So it's sort of a myths versus reality of capitalism that have been built up by all of these anti-capitalist propagandists. And just to give you a few examples, I have a chapter called "How Capitalism Enriched the Working Class," which is kind of fun to write because I know there are a lot of the lefties out there like to make everybody believe that the workers are absolutely miserable under capitalism. I know at my school and at Walter Block's school, Loyola, a big thing. They're a big crusade for the living wage. It was sort of a super minimum wage, and if you read some of this literature, it makes it sound like get a job and you're just absolutely miserable. It's the worst thing you could do. You have to go and work at a job. And I always ask these people, why are you so stingy? Why don't you call this the living high on the hog wage and make it $1,000 an hour? Why $10 an hour? They're always, but it's these people who are always trying to convince workers that they should be miserable working. So I deal with that and look at how capitalism has enriched the working class beyond anyone's belief 100 years ago. There's a chapter on the myth of the robber barons. Some of the American industrialists in the post-Civil War era were robber barons in that they were mercantilists. They were in bed with the government. They got government subsidies. A good example, I write a good bit about the building of the transcontinental railroads. And there was one transcontinental railroad in America that was built without government subsidies, without even land grants, and it was the Great Northern, built by James J. Hill, who was a real villain in the eyes of the academic left. And he bragged in his own biography that he never took a dime from the government, and not even land. He paid the Indians for rights of way across Indian land in either cattle or corn or money, whereas the subsidized railroads called in General Sherman and the Army and just killed all the Indians. And in my Lincoln book, I quote Sherman as saying, "We're not going to let a few ragged, thieving Indians stand in the way of the railroads." He said that after the Civil War, when his job, 3 months after the Civil War ended, Sherman was put in charge of killing all the Indians in the Plains Indians, or capturing them, putting them on, I call them concentration camps, but most people call them reservations. And so, but it was sort of veiled corporate welfare for the railroad industries. But then you had James J. Hill, who did it on his own, private financing. He and his business partners and his investors, and they built a better railroad. They built it quicker. And if you read the history of the transcontinental railroads in America, you can understand why the progressives were so successful in bashing capitalism, because this was colossal corruption. They would do such things as, since they got a per mile subsidy from the government, they would build on top of ice packs in the winter, and then when the ice would melt, the tracks would all collapse. But that was a good thing because you got paid per mile. So the more tracks you built, the more subsidy you got from the government. And also politics meant that any member of Congress who wanted a line, an extension, or an appendage of the railroad down to his hometown, where maybe 2 people per month would ride the train, if you wanted his vote, you had to do that. You had to build that. And so these railroads became notoriously inefficient, and whereas James J. Hill's did not. And then it's an interesting part of his story is that after the turn of the century, after he'd been so successful for so many years, his company was sued for allegedly violating the antitrust laws, and it was one of the very first federal antitrust cases. That was called the Northern Securities case. His holding company was called Northern Securities at that time. So I've suspected that it was sort of revenge for making the government subsidized railroads look bad, but I can't really prove that. There's the myth of antitrust. The story we're told about antitrust is that markets run amok and create monopolies. I've done a lot of historical research over the years, and what I found is that the industries that were accused of being monopolies in the late 19th century in America were all expanding output, dropping prices, innovating much faster than any other industries in the country. This was a period of deflation, and so antitrust was always anti-competitive in my view from the very beginning. It was a protectionist law. And then also I go into, did capitalism cause the Great Depression? Everyone assumes it did. But no one except the people who attend Mises University seem to know that Herbert Hoover was a statist. Everyone seems that the standard story is that Herbert Hoover was an advocate of laissez-faire, and that's what got us into trouble, caused the Great Depression. And thank goodness FDR came along with big government and saved capitalism from itself. That's sort of there are books with that title, Saving Capitalism from Itself. And but Hoover was such a statist that I quote Franklin Roosevelt's top economic advisor for the duration from 1932 until 1945 was a man named Rexford Tugwell, and a Harvard economist, Rexford Tugwell, and he says this: the ideas embodied in the New Deal legislation were a compilation of those which had come to maturity under President Herbert Hoover's aegis. We all of us owed much to Hoover. So he pretty much said FDR copied what Hoover was doing. And another quote that I'll offer you about Herbert Hoover, this is from a biography by Joan Hoff Wilson, a biography of Hoover, and he's describing his economic beliefs. His economic beliefs was this: in capitalism, there was too much lawlessness, destructive competition, and economic waste, too much unemployment and repetitiveness in factory work. The 12-hour day was too long. Labor lacked the guarantee of collective bargaining. Child labor still existed despite pre-war progressive legislation. Education was inadequate. Most people were making too much money, far beyond the needs of stimulation to initiative, whatever that is. And so he was a big idiot when it comes to economics. Even though, now we have the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and most people think Milton Friedman is there. But it's named after somebody whose policies Milton Friedman, I'm pretty sure, would disagree with almost everything that Herbert Hoover did as Commerce Secretary in the 20s and then as president. Among the things he did was he sort of implicitly threatened the major corporations in America with who knows what, IRS audits and so forth, if they dropped wages during the recession, which is exactly what you want to have if you want to minimize unemployment. You want wages to be flexible. So he brought all the major corporation executives in and persuaded them to not drop wages. He started big public works programs to try to stimulate the economy, of course, ignoring opportunity cost. He raised taxes. He started up the farm cartel business by paying farmers not to grow food and raise crops. He signed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the big protectionist tariff. He started the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which diverted eventually $50 billion in capital directed by the government into various government-favored enterprises and away from the private sector. And this lasted until 1955, the RFC, and it was finally disbanded when it became a scandal that the government was funding strip joints. That's literally how the Reconstruction Finance Corporation came to become defunct in 1955. But I quote the guy who ran it for Hoover and then later Roosevelt as bragging that they were even lending money to people who had droves of reindeer in Alaska. So any votes that you could buy with government money, they would try to do it. And so Hoover was a big statist, and of course monetary expansion that occurred during the 20s. I also talk about how Murray Rothbard, I think, had it all right in his book America's Great Depression in terms of what caused the real bust of the Depression. And then in the next chapter, it's called. What did I call it? I forget what I call it. It's been such a long time. It's on. Sometimes the publisher changes it around. It's how the New Deal crippled capitalism. How the New Deal crippled capitalism, and it's a compilation of a lot of the research that's been done over the past several decades by economists about how Roosevelt's New Deal actually made the Great Depression worse and longer. And a great book on this is Out of Work by Vedder and Galloway, if you want to read up on this. And of course, Jim Powell's new book, FDR's Folly, incorporates a lot of this research too. And for example, unemployment in 1938 was 19% still. 1939, it was 17.2%. So the Great Depression didn't end when World War II started. World War II started, and 16 million men were sent overseas. That's hardly a way to end a recession. Send everybody over to get blown up and killed, possibly in a war. And one of the really striking facts that most people don't know is that the Great Depression in America, anyway, it didn't really end until there was a demobilization of the military after World War II, when the federal budget went from roughly $95 billion to $35 billion in 2 years. And all the Keynesians were terrified that this would cause another Great Depression because of that big reduction in aggregate demand by that much, well, $65 billion. But of course, you just got all this money that had been wasted on bombs and not wasted, but from an economic perspective, war is the opposite of capitalism. War is about blowing things up, killing people, and so forth. And you get all these resources that were used to blow things up and kill people, and put them back in the pockets of the people, and the economy took off after in the post-war years. And so what ended the Great Depression was the taming of big government that was initiated by the war and by Roosevelt. But we still live with the legacy of destruction of the New Deal years. And I don't want to go much further. There's much more good stuff. I end the book with a big trashing of Michael Moore at the very end. And this idiotic book by Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dime, and things like this. So a lot of the people at my school, probably like Walter Block's school, just swoon over these books, Nickel and Dime. She's the PhD biologist who writes for Time magazine and places like that, who pretended to be an indigent immigrant, I guess, and worked at fast food joints, and then wrote a whole book about how she made the great scientific discovery that fast food joints don't pay much. And that's her fast food. That's her discovery. And this is all a part of the campaign for the so-called living wage, the super minimum wage. That's the point of that book, because at the end she makes a big pitch for another wonderful thing, more public housing. She makes a pitch for more public housing, more dilapidated hellholes to house the low-income people, and of course the super minimum wage. And Michael Moore does much of the same in his book, Stupid White Men and Downsize This. I sort of finished with the review of both of these. And they know nothing at all about economics. They confuse mercantilism with capitalism. And Moore makes some good criticisms of businessmen who are in bed with government, but calls it capitalism, and then argues for even more government intervention, which will lead to more of the same thing. It won't lead to less corruption. It'll lead to more of the same thing. But he doesn't seem to get that. So his movie on the war was a lot better than his book on economics. But maybe I'll stop there. I don't want to give the whole thing away because I want you people to buy it. And I'll stop there. And if anybody has any questions or declarations to make or anything like that, weather reports.
Question? Yeah, right now.
Yeah.
Well, if I were to want to write a book, who would I talk to?
Who would you talk to if you wanted to write a book? Nobody. You sit down and you write the book. You can't write and talk at the same time.
Well, presumably you want to publish it, so
realistically, the way the way I walked into this is like the publisher of this book is Crown Forum, which is a division of Random House, and Random House is the biggest commercial publisher in the country, and they published my Lincoln book, but they called me. They had read my article on Lincoln in the Independent Review, and asked me, would you like to turn this article into a book? And it just so happened that I had just finished doing that. And so, and I hadn't even looked for a publisher yet. And so then they asked me to write the second book. And so that's how I got a relationship with a commercial publisher. But what most people do is, who are starting out, and you want to write a book for a commercial publisher, you have to write the manuscript, you have to write the book, and then you find a literary agent. And you can go on randomhouse.com, and they have a link to dozens and dozens of literary agents, because the major commercial publishers will not look at a manuscript unless it comes from a literary agent. If it comes from an author, they'll throw it in the trash. It's just their policy. Very few of them will ever do that. And a literary agent is generally somebody who will they'll be your marketing agent. If they like this and think it's a saleable manuscript, they'll ask you for either a fee or a percentage of the advance. Commercial publishers will say if they pay you a $10,000 advance, the agent might want 15% of that as their fee for finding but it's all negotiable. It's all like that. So if you want to write a book and have it published by a commercial publisher, I think that's the route that you need to take, unless you have some personal contact with somebody. Yeah.
Do you think Leonard Peacock's going to be mad that you wrote this, since might draw attention away from that other capitalist book?
I don't know. I asked them to send him a copy in case they might want to review it on their website or something like that. But I don't see why it would draw attention. I want them to help me promote it, because in the very first page of chapter 1, the chapter is called "What is Capitalism?" I quote. I have little blurbs at the beginning of each chapter, and at the top is one by Murray Rothbard defining capitalism, and then Ayn Rand defining capitalism. And I have on the back of the book will be blurbs by George Reisman, Lou Rockwell, Ron Paul, and Murray Wiedenbaum, who was Reagan's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So I'm going to have Reisman on the back saying nice things about the book, and I quote Ayn Rand on page 1, so they can't be too angry with it. What's that?
They don't like Reisman anymore.
They don't? Okay, well maybe I should change it then. Ask them. But I don't care. Who are they anyway? I mean, if it's kind of odd if they claim to be pro-capitalist and they don't like competition, that's very odd to me. It seems to me they should be pro-competition. But they're going to send them one for sure.
You mentioned Treatise and how they've gone from being sort of a luxury good for the very rich to something very.
Yeah.
Do you see sort of a private space flight doing that or not?
Private space flight?
Station 1 with the enterprise.
Oh, sure. Wouldn't you know the guy with the pointy ears would ask that question? Just kidding. You don't have pointy ears. Huh? The thing is, Mr. Spock. Yeah, why not? That's been the whole history of capitalism. Is von Mises mentions things like nylon stockings were only available to the Queen of England at first, and then by the time he was writing, it was ordinary working girls could buy as many nylon stockings they wanted, and it's not refrigerators to automobiles. That's been the whole history of capitalism. And great inventions are. My first personal computer, when I bought an IBM PC in around 1982 or something like that, was $4,000. And in 1982, $4,000 is a good piece of change for a personal computer that was probably, less than 1/10,000th as powerful as my laptop today. And so the same thing happens everywhere. I don't know why if space flight is privatized, sure, I expect that to be happen. That's what'll happen. We'll go for a spin. Maybe we can finally secede after all. Although it would be cheaper to just put Congress on the spaceship and send them Send them away.
You have to spend your book on that book early, so.
Yeah. Oh, I would gladly do that. I would gladly sell my house and finance that. But I was, yeah. One day I remember I was in a really good mood because I read in a paper some years ago that United States Senator Jake Garn was sent up into outer space in a spaceship. And I just thought that was just such a neat thing that we got rid of one politician for a couple of days like that. And he was the chairman of the committee that funded NASA, I think, at the time. And then John Glenn, but he did that after he was out of the Senate. But somebody else had a hand up somewhere.
What part are you most proud of in there? Small enough to skip to.
What part of the book?
What part are you least proud of?
What part am I least proud of? And most proud of? No, you really should read the whole book because it's a short book. It's not a big long book. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's all pretty equal. If I were to guess what is going to be criticized the most, it's an unabashed defense of capitalism. And in fact, I've already had some criticism on Amazon. There's some outfit called Publishers Weekly that claims to be the gatekeeper of all books that get published. And so they write little blurb reviews all over the place on new books coming out, and it was real sort of sourpuss type of language on this little blurb on Amazon about since it's a defense of capitalism, no excuses. And so they got it wrong. They had incorrect statements of fact about what's in the book already, and it's up on Amazon now. And then there was a second one that was pretty good. It was from the American Library Association, which is a big organization, and they actually were. It was complimentary and it was straightforward, and so I expect. My measuring rod would be whichever chapter gets attacked the most is the one I'm most proud of, and I suspect it might be the one on antitrust because I call it a protectionist fraud from day one, and that's one of the keystones of the attack on capitalism. The notion that left on their own, corporations will become monopolies, and therefore they need to be regulated. And antitrust is a sort of a proxy for all regulation of business. And so, and I argue for the complete abolition of all antitrust. And so that's probably the one that will be attacked the most. I suspect that, and plus the one saying FDR made the Great Depression worse and not better, because that's what everyone is taught in elementary school, the lie that he saved us from capitalism. So. See, the man in the back there.
I have a wonder, and it links to some of the comments that were made about Castro earlier and the state of the society. And I wondered what your thought would be. Why is it appropriate that over the last 4 years, for instance, I was able to buy a Volvo, but I couldn't buy a cigar of choice? And is that appropriate? Is that proper political leverage to employ?
What, that you can't buy a cigar? Why can't you buy a cigar? You mean you can't buy Cubans?
Right.
Well, yeah, we live in a
Just the embargo in general.
Yeah. What is your question, though?
Is that appropriate? Are embargoes for...
Well, other countries all over the world can go to Cuba and supply Cuba with goods that we don't supply them with. So it doesn't seem to have worked much. Castro's been in power for a long time, hasn't he? And since the early 60s, he's been the iron grip. The embargo doesn't seem to have done much but entertain the Cubans in Miami. They feel very strongly about it, but realistically, I don't think it's had much effect. Castro's still there. He's as powerful as ever. He's totally ruined his country. Our friend Yuri Maltsev was in Cuba last year and gave a talk at the Austrian Scholars Conference about life in Cuba. And he said the average person in Cuba is given an income by the government of the equivalent of $10 a month. And they might have relatives in Miami or somewhere who will send them $100 a month. So therefore, they have no incentive whatsoever to work. And that's a big problem. So just that has totally ruined the work ethic in Cuba. And the amount of food, they're given rations of food in Cuba. And so the embargo, it doesn't seem to have had any effect. This is what it's been like for all these years. So embargoes are always gotten around anyway. When we supposedly had an embargo on South Africa years ago before the apartheid was dismantled, but my friend Jim Bennett went there on some government boondoggle. I think the U.S. Information Agency offered to send him on a trip around the world somewhere, and so he looked at it as a way of getting some of his tax money back. So he went, and he told me that all these countries that claimed that they weren't shipping goods to South Africa were, but they were just putting the goods on ships with different flags, with somebody from the next country next to South, Rhodesia or someplace, would have their flag, but it would be goods from the U.S. or somewhere. And so these embargoes never work that well anyway. You can buy Cubans anywhere in the Caribbean if you're really dying to have Cuban cigars, or Miami for that matter. I think so. You don't have to go to the Caribbean. What's that?
Key West, too.
Oh yeah, Key West. Yeah.
Where exactly?
Yeah. I don't like Cubans myself. They're too harsh. So we know we have a Volvo driving, cigar smoking libertarian back here. So.
Do you have any ideas for your next book?
Yeah, the next book I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've been when you write a book, it's a big commitment, and I want it to sell, and I want a commercial publisher to sell it for me, and so the title so far, the title sounds a lot better than what the book looks like, because the book, I haven't written it yet. But the Revolution of 1913, because we got the Fed, the income tax, and the 17th Amendment all in that 1 year. And the 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. They used to be appointed by state legislatures, and so that was a disastrous year. And I think it would be a good thing to explain. There was a long debate. The American founders didn't have an income tax on purpose. There was good reasons they didn't want taxes on income. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, defined what he thought good government, and then part of it was that people should keep all of the fruit of their labor. None of it should be taxed away. And so then we had the first income tax during the Civil War in the Lincoln administration. Then that was ended several years later. And then Grover Cleveland, when he was president later in the century, there was an income tax debate. And we finally got it in 1913. I think that whole story of why there was opposition to the income tax, and then what it has done, the effects of the income tax since then, and the same with the Fed. Why was there a big debate from the very beginning of the Republic over central banking, and there was a big victory in the same year the Fed was enacted, and then say something about the disastrous effects of the Fed since then. And the same with the 17th Amendment. It was sort of the last nail in the coffin of states' rights, the 17th Amendment, because at least when state legislatures, which can be as corrupt as any government, appointed senators, at least they would worry about voting for laws that would be directly harmful to the people in their state. But now they don't have to worry about that. I gave a speech at a big convention in California, and it was a political thing, and there were senators and congressmen from probably all 50 states out in California raising money for their reelection. Why? Because that's where the money is. That's what they were saying. It was Silicon Valley and a lot of wealthy computer entrepreneurs. So if you're from Massachusetts, that's where you want to go raise your campaign. It wasn't like that always, and so I think that's what I have in mind next: the Revolution of 1913, because I see that as a major breaking point in statism in America. We couldn't have entered World War I without the Fed and income tax. We couldn't have financed the American involvement in World War I. And Jim Powell has a new book coming out in the spring on Wilson, and how Wilson's American intervention into World War I led to World War II, and he makes the case that there wouldn't have been a World War II had it not been for Wilson's decision to he wanted to get Americans into World War I, and that couldn't happen without the Fed and income tax, because it costs a lot of money to do that. But,
I was going to ask you, if we could get rid of the 17th Amendment, get it taken out again, do you think that would have a good effect on campaign finance? In other words, a negative effect to take some of the negative effects away from campaign finance? Since it costs $20 million to get a senator elected?
No, campaign finance. No, as long as since we no longer have any constitutional restraints on government, politicians will find a way to take bribes to pass laws in return for the bribes. Getting rid of the 17th Amendment will help because there will be a price to pay for voting for legislation that directly harms the people in your state, special interest legislation. So I think it'll be a little help, but I don't see it as any magic. If you want evidence that politicians in America no longer pay attention to the Constitution, the example I've been given for a few years, I need to update it though, it's kind of old, was when Joycelyn Elders was the U.S. Surgeon General. Do you remember why Clinton fired her? She wanted to start up a federal masturbation education project. So when I heard that, I thought, well, if the people in Washington think the Constitution allows for masturbation education funded by taxes, there are no limits to what taxes can fund. It's just anything anybody dreams up in their feverish mind is a legitimate thing. And so that's how that was even too much for Bill Clinton, if you can believe that. Not that he wouldn't have enjoyed being one of the instructors, but politically it didn't fly. He lost too many votes in the South if he went through with that. I think he would have won votes in Massachusetts, I'm sure.
Do you think there's any hope left to change the system from within, or is it just too broke to fix?
How did we get to that question? I was a bit optimistic when communism fell, and it's still alive and well in American universities. But I mean, Soviet Union and these countries. But because I thought, if communism can end, maybe we can get rid of our rotten system here in this country. But then the reality of it was the neocons took over the government. The big government conservatives. It totally took over the Republican Party. The Republican Party took over all three branches of the government, and they proclaimed to be welfare statists at home and imperialists abroad. That's what they're about. And so they've gotten us into this crazy, unnecessary war. The spending has run amok. We have $15 billion to send to Africa for AIDS things. While with a $500 billion deficit. And all that, so I don't think so. I think politics today is either the Democrats who are socialists or the Republicans who are socialists, and for the most part, socialists and imperialists. The Republicans have become worse than the Democrats. There are at least some Democrats who are against this crazy war in Iraq, and so they're both in favor of an expanded welfare state. But the Democrat Party is now actually better than the Republicans as far as limiting government. And the Republican Party always has been the party of big government. This myth that the Republicans were the party of small government, all during the late 19th century, it was the Democrats who were the party of free trade and limited government. And then they were ruined by Woodrow Wilson. Then ruined even further by Roosevelt. And at the same time, Herbert Hoover, he was a big government guy. Where has there been a limited government? Maybe Calvin Coolidge was okay. He didn't do much. Calvin Coolidge and people like that. But other than that, there have been. And Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, and they've always been the party of corporatism, mercantilism, graft, under the disguise of morality, disguised by talk of morality. So I don't see much hope for it.
One of the things like cutting corporate spending is that there's a lot of, I guess, since that there is spending, someone benefits from it, and it's impossible to cut because everyone has that project. I mean, first thing for me is government funding for, like, say, research, right? I mean, I'm not saying that, it's absolutely, what do you think do you think there's a role for the government funding basic R&D? Because, the standard argument is that these are long-term research projects, usually open-ended, that, we don't know whether or not they will yield any benefit for hundreds of years, but, just...
Hundreds of years? No one should be funding that. No, I see no role whatsoever. the private sector does a better job of funding the right projects. I mentioned in one of my talks today, there's a book by Antonio Martino called Science Funding about the politicization of R&D funding by the government. And anyway, the reality, even the amount of R&D spending by the government is a tiny fraction of private R&D spending. It's something like 2 to 3%, something like that. So we don't, even though it's a lot of money in absolute dollars, percentage-wise compared to all the R&D funding that goes on, Bill Gates spends $3 to $5 billion a year on research and development in his own computer industry, and so R&D funding by the government is always going to be determined by politics. In one of my talks yesterday, I posed the question of if you were on a congressional panel and in charge of R&D funding for the computer industry in 1978, and here are your choices of who to fund: IBM, the company that's located in a district of the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, or 6 dorky-looking hippies hanging out in Bill Gates' dad's garage. Who would you put your money behind? If you're a politician, you're going to put IBM because it's safe. You're going to win yourself political points by funding the company in the district of the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And there's no way on earth you would put money behind Microsoft. You'd be a lunatic as a politician. But venture capitalists did. Real venture capitalists did put their money behind Microsoft and not IBM and not the politically connected company. But that's how government R&D works. Yes.
Well, there's a lot of books written about how, say, defense department funding or the internet or like NASA's research, some deal with all sorts of all these different space technology, satellite communications. I mean, there's a lot of stuff written about.
Well, sure. If the government spends enough money, it has to produce some things. There's always the opportunity cost. So what's not seen is what would have been created had that money been spent elsewhere. All those engineers, all those people who were induced to get degrees in aerospace engineering would have been doing something else had we not been sending rocket ships to the moon to collect rocks. They would have been doing things that human beings actually benefited from. Beyond that, the dean of the business school where I once taught once worked at NASA, and his background was marketing. And he once told me that when he was there, they did a study that showed that all of the increase in GDP during the 1960s was due to the NASA budget. All of it, 100%. So you get a lot of phony, quote, research out of these agencies that do this funding too, that, things like that. But, a historical example would be, people think that the government was necessary for the transcontinental railroads to be built because at the time there was no transcontinental railroad in 1862 when they started building this. But James J. Hill did start around 10 years later after the government roads were being built. But he would have started earlier had he not had government subsidized competition to contend with. And the fact that he started later rather than sooner, so what? Why is it necessarily a good thing that we had a transcontinental railroad in 1870 instead of 1875? He ended up building a road much better, much more efficient, no corruption because it was private money. And so, yes, you could say that these inventions that the government funds, whether it's the internet or whatever, they probably would have been invented by the private sector a few years later. But it's not. I don't see why it's necessarily a good thing that they were invented sooner rather than later, and then that the government had its hand in it. With the internet, it was only once the private sector got a hold of it that it really became useful to people and became what it is today. Once the government, DARPA was the acronym for the Defense Department bureaucracy, had it. They do what bureaucracies do and just sort of did nothing with it. And, played games with it apparently, but
the government happens to be involved in, then we'll always say, without the government, what would we do? The argument that without the government, what would we do with the internet? Just to the Soviet Union, without the government, what would we do for eggs? If the government is monopolizing some field or is the main one running that field, then naturally it's going to seem as though any benefit that comes from that field is coming from the government.
Oh, sure. If the government had taken over the shoe industry 200 years ago, I guarantee you people today would be saying, Well, we have to have the government make shoes. Who will make shoes if the government doesn't make shoes? People get used to that, and that's one of the values of economic education, is that it gets you to think of opportunity costs, the alternatives. What if that's the way to think is, the government has been doing it for a long time, but what's the alternative? And sometimes we don't know the alternatives because entrepreneurs will tell us what the alternatives are if they're allowed the freedom to develop the internet or the railroads or whatever. In retrospect, we see that the private building of railroads was a huge benefit, much better than the government building of railroads. I also have a chapter in this book called Highways of Capitalism, where I look at the arguments that were made that the free rider problem was so severe that you needed government to build roads. And that was not true in the early days of America anyway, because there were hundreds of private road building companies that they called them turnpikes, that built roads everywhere. The Mormons built private railroads in Utah. There were private railroads built in Vermont before any government money was ever put into them. So we have a historical record that this is just not true, that we don't need government money for these things, but most people have been led to believe that we do. The government always has to be involved in roads, railroads, all these things. But if you dig a little bit, you find that these are usually fairy tales. Any other brilliant declarations by anybody out there, other than something like beer is half price at one of the local bars uptown or something? No, I don't know that. I think this is supposed to end at 8 o'clock, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, well then we'll call it a night.